Good morning, Dr. McQueenie here, and I want to welcome you to the beginning of an ethics module for PA 315. I think I've told most of you in the face-to-face class, and certainly we've tried to make that clear in the syllabus and other material, that the ethics portion of this class I think is perhaps one of the most important takeaways that you'll have for the entire quarter. It's a step back from the traditional way that we go about teaching and learning in most undergraduate courses, where you read the book and you memorize things and you take a test and you come away with some level of information and knowledge that you didn't have before. For this week, this is a week that was ordained by the decision makers of the college for one real purpose, and that is to do our part in both the College of Business and Public Administration, both the departments of both departments in the college, to provide students with the insight of what truly have become significant social issues with tremendous personal, financial, political consequences, and that is the evolving standard by which society views our individual ethical responsibility to behave in a way that's consistent with both our own ethical standards, our morality, and the larger expectations of society. You know, we've been confronted in recent past with a number of bad decisions that have had severe consequences on millions of people who've been affected because leaders or individuals either overtly took actions that they knew were wrong or crossed an ethical line and caused distress and pain and suffering to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Or we have seen consequences when good people, reasonable people, faced with what we're going to call an ethical moment, decide that they can't get involved for one reason or another, many times good reasons. But the lack of engagement when an ethical moment is addressed is probably as devastating to the social fabric that values ethics as people who are actually committing the ethical crime, because we all have an opportunity as we go through our schooling and our jobs and our family to be confronted with a moment in which we simply say to ourselves, what we see happening is not right. And if we don't get involved and do something about it, there could be tremendous consequences. Now, this is not a class about religion or do-gooderness or anything that's more of an ideological soft shoe routine. It's just a matter of reminding all of us that we're going to face throughout our lives periods of time in which we're going to have choices to make. And those choices are going to require us to think carefully about our own obligations to the standards that we believe in, and acknowledge the fact that we believe in these standards because they've basically supported us individually, our families, the law, and society throughout history. And we all are going to have a choice. We're going to have a choice to either do something when we are confronted with a moment or ignore it. The examples can be small. When you notice a group of students cheating in a classroom on a test that you worked hard for and your colleagues have worked hard for, and you notice that they have done something that they're apparently going to get away with. Is it ratting to rat them out? Or is there some sort of ethical responsibility there to engage yourself, whether it's to the students directly or whatever choice is the best example? Is looking the other way appropriate? And if it is, when does that standard of looking the other way suffice? Is it look the other way when you see someone stealing something? When you see a group of students abusing or taking advantage of an individual through bigoted actions or prejudice or just having fun? When you see a crime being committed? When you see someone calling for help and walk away? When you see in the corporate structure that you're going to be working in, an individual at the high end of the corporate structure doing something with the finances that you know is wrong, but you're working for that person. How about when you're part of a corporate board meeting, when the majority of the people in the meeting decide to take actions that you know are unethical and probably illegal? Do you go along with it? Do you look the other way, or do you let it happen? How about when you're confronted with a boss who says, I want you to commit a crime? It's a little crime, and no one's going to admit it, and no one's going to acknowledge it, and you're probably going to get away with it. But what are you going to do when those situations confront you, as they are bound to confront you throughout your jobs and your career? The purpose of this class is not to give you answers. I can't give you answers. I don't know that anybody can give you answers. The purpose of the class is for you to recognize that these moments exist And the lack of individuals acknowledging that there are choices to be made in these situations, choices that can impact on dozens, if not hundreds, and potentially millions of people. Not recognizing those moments is bad for all of us and all of society. Recognizing them is important. What you do about them is your choice. But hopefully a deliverable coming out of this course is that you'll be sensitized to the notion of what I call an ethical moment and the obligation you have to do something. Even if you intentionally ignore or decide to not take any action, at least you've acknowledged it, you've weighed the consequences, and you've decided for your own reasons that it's best for me to be quiet. Those are overt decisions that I believe we're all better off if we all make. The worst thing we can do is to ignore them, pretend they didn't happen, look the other way, and let society go down a road in which there is no cultural standard, or there's a weakening cultural standard for doing the right thing. Look, the examples are legion. We see them every day. We are still realizing the impact of the Enron scandal, and we're going to be doing a case study on that in this class, in which a few executives decided to make certain high-risk investments. When the investments didn't pan out, they decided they had to cover it up. They had to cook the books. They had to continue their terrible ways of doing business, and they not only put an entire company at risk, but they caused it to disintegrate, a company in which at least 1.5 million people were dependent on for not only their wages, their jobs, but their retirements, their 401ks, their livelihood. Entire communities suffered because of the actions of a handful of people that decided that they could commit ethical violations or they could cover up ethical violations, or people in the executive staff could witness ethical violations, standards that violated every known principle of accounting and financial management, and yet they were quiet, they stopped it, they allowed it to happen. That was devastating to society, devastating to business, and wound up with the passage of congressional laws that dramatically increased the regulation of not only that company, but all companies. When business people and business students, and I've read your discussions, are upset about government regulations, the one thing that has to be acknowledged that just about every regulation that I've ever done or studied is a response to some gigantic transgression or abdication of the right way of doing business that caused huge social distress. And the people, the sovereign people, look to government for a solution, and government responds with more regulations, which in effect constrain, some say choke, some say limit the success of business. All true. But the starting point is usually a bad thing happened, and good people allowed a bad thing to happen. And that's what we're trying to get at in this course. After the Enron scandal, the industry was overwhelmed with requests to conduct ethical training among the accountants that worked with big companies, the accounting staffs of companies, and the executives, to see to it that at least there is an awareness of the ethical, moral, and legal responsibilities that everyone has to not shade the truth, to not cut corners, to certainly come clean when mistakes are made, because the consequences, when that does not happen to both the individual and the group that's dependent on them, are incredible. Think for a second of poor General Petraeus. I say poor because by every measure, this was an outstanding man, a military officer that had been the epitome of success throughout his career, a critical player in the turnaround of what would have been a disastrous end of the Iraqi war. It was a bad ending, but it would have been disastrous had he not used all of his energies and intellect to fashion a final surge a policy that at least allowed a moderate stalemate in the military arena. He became CIA director, and he was rumored to be a leading candidate for president. He had a following, more importantly, that believed in his ethical virtues, that believed in his standards, that believed in him. I knew many of those people when I was in Washington, D.C., and I knew people who trusted him implicitly. And then he had a moment. He had an affair with a woman that was not his wife. You can make your own decisions on the ethical standards of that, but in conducting the affair, there was a lot of cover-up, secrecy, deceit, which began to unravel a lot of things that affected his life. In dealing with her, she was a writer who was writing a book about him, and he began talking to her about information that was otherwise classified, and began leaving classified material outside of the government security zones in her possession. And in doing so, he committed a felony. He was indicted, he was charged, and he pled guilty. And those actions not only destroyed a man and a career, but I'm telling you this because I know it. It devastated hundreds of junior officers, employees, not to mention his family and his close associates, all of whom trusted in him. The damage done to the network that saw General Petraeus as a leader they can believe in was devastating to people's view of government leaders, the future, etc. And it happened because in facing an ethical moment, he did not consider the consequences of action that perhaps as an individual may have been understandable, but as a leader was horrific. The purpose of this class is to have you assess these actions with the context of your situation and saying, given my situation, or given a situation I may be in, given a choice that I will be facing, what are the options that I should be ready to take? And we're going to do this through a series of case studies that I have recorded on real-life situations. They're very interesting case studies, and I've written them up in the instructions that were passed out earlier this week. Each group is going to be given a case study to review. They're about an hour, 30 minutes to an hour video in which the situation is laid out, and I'd like you all to review it and to discuss it among yourselves and to pursue the project by answering 6 specific questions, which I'll get to in a moment. But I think you're going to find this particular module one that challenges you not in your ability to learn and regurgitate and respond well on exams, but it's going to challenge you to think through very difficult dilemmas, difficult options, choices that have to be made for anyone in a similar situation, and what you think you would do about them. And I think we'll enjoy it. Now we're going to proceed by going through a few things this week that I think will be interesting. In this video, I'm going to try and capture it rather briefly. First of all, a very brief discussion of what I mean by ethics, what we're talking about, ethical standards we live by. I'm going to give you my view of ethical standards in government, all very brief. And then I want to discuss the notion of the project itself and how we're going to perform it, and end with a reference to the text, a very good discussion in the text of what we call corporate social responsibility. This week's assignments are very easy to pursue. They have to do with reading the relevant chapters in the text and reviewing the PowerPoint presentation that you'll see in this video. To review your particular case study, and I encourage you to go beyond that case study and find related ones, or text, or even going to Wikipedia to get the full story and describing and understanding the situation. In some cases, I've added a couple of short additional videos that help give a different perspective that I would urge your group to look at. You're going to have to engage in a group discussion on the topic itself so you all share the same understanding of what went on and what the questions are. I'd like each of you to understand all of the questions, and I'd like then one person in each group, as I said in the instructions, to prepare to do a one-page PowerPoint response to each question. I'd like the discussions to happen through the group function on Blackboard to the extent possible. The face-to-face class, it gets a benefit because they will be meeting in class and I'll be giving class time. The online class, it's a little bit of an extra effort, but because it's an online class, I have to ensure that it takes place. So I would urge you, and I'm asking you to do as much as possible of your group discussions in the group blog. We'll get to that in a second. The assignment is going to require you to answer one question, and only one question, so it's not a lot of work, but it's a question that is a series of questions that takes you on the journey of understanding the ethical situation you face to the actions you may want to take if confronted with a similar situation. And there's 6 parts to this question, and each student will have one to answer, and an answer requires filling out the equivalent of a one-page PowerPoint in how you frame your response. I'll give you an example in a second. For the face-to-face class, and I'll discuss this more in class, I'd like the answers to be put on a pretty fancy, interesting poster board, and we'll have demonstrations in class that make for a very lively discussion. Those have gone very well. Can't really do that online, so for the online class, I'll just ask the group to prepare a typical PowerPoint presentation and post the presentation, and we'll do the best we can to handle discussions as we normally handle discussions in an online class. I'll be grading the PowerPoint deck once it's submitted to the assignment folder, and the grade is going to be both on your content and the extent to which I believe you have participated in the assignment. The questions that you're going to answer are very simple, but they're simple in the way they're framed, but not necessarily simple in terms of an easy answer. And the 6 of them are posted here for your review. First of all, slide 1 is going to ask you to describe the ethical situation. I've done this in the instructions, and that just means describe the situation that you believe is the primary issue behind the case study in the video, and what makes you think it's a significant ethical issue. The second one is going to ask you to narrow down and focus on the ethical moment and the choices. And this is a key part of the presentation, and that's why each of you have to work with each other so you set up a presentation that flows. This cannot be a series of individual slides that stick together with somebody with a big stapler. This is a group discussion of all 6 points, and one person takes the lead in responding to each slide. The ethical moment is your choice as to, in looking at the video, where was a moment in the course of developing the story where the principal of the story, either a person or a corporation, was faced with a clear yes or no action. Do I go forward? Or do I stop? Do I do nothing? Do I look the other way? We all have those situations, and again, the deliverable of this project is to recognize those ethical moments and crystallize the choices that you have. No right or wrong answer, but be aware of it and be comfortable in your response. So each of these videos has an ethical moment, and slide 2 will be defining that moment. Slide 3 is going to ask you, was there a different perspective besides the perspective that we see that it's in the voice of the narrator or in the author? Can you see the situation? Can you see a way of perhaps justifying what otherwise would have been a bad action? Or if there was a good action, perhaps modifying it, saying he didn't have to do that. Is there a different way of looking at that same ethical moment? And I'd like slide 3 to talk about a different perspective. What else may have been done, or how else may have the situation been seen? And that's a very important part of the analysis as well. Number 4, I'm going to ask somebody to rate, and this is again a group response, how difficult on a scale of 1 to 5 was this issue? Was the ethical situation so clear that no matter how painful the decision, it was an easy one? Or was the ethical decision hazy, fuzzy, and people of good faith can honestly differ and grind their teeth and wring their hands over a decision? I'm going to ask you to rate that on a scale of 1 to 5, and advise in your presentation as to whether you think it's a relatively easy decision, which would be a 5, a relatively tough decision, which would be a 5, or a relatively easy decision, which would be a 1. And in doing that, you're going to be able to give a little bit of substance to in doing that, you're going to be able to convey the extent to which you are at one with the decision maker. And you understand the dilemma that he or she faced, and you can begin to share with him the difficulties and the agonies associated with the decision. You'll see some of this in the video we're going to talk about in class in a second. I'm going to ask you, number 5, to step back a bit and look at the issue of organizational awareness. Is there a chance that a different kind of an organizational environment, a different kind of leadership, a different kind of message, a different kind of culture, a different kind of training could have avoided the situation entirely? Was the situation inevitable given the situation, or were there things that could have been done that could have mitigated? Were there things that could have been done in Enron prior to the final actions which clearly violated law and accounting standards and caused the dismay that may have been difficult but may have averted the scandal? Were there things that General Petraeus could have done prior to involving classified documents in his relationship that could have been different, that would have saved all the anguish, much of the anguish and the pain and suffering? Are there things that could have been done in a cheating scandal before you had to face a choice to actually turn in your friends or your colleagues or look the other way? Are there things that the organization could have been done to avoid the situation? That's where I really would like you to pay some attention, and that's what slide number 5 is about. And finally, slide number 6 is to review the decision that was made and ask as a group, and one person will facilitate the group decision but describe it, if the group would have done the same thing and why, or if the group would have done something else, what would that have been, and what was the reasoning for that? And that's essentially what it is. As you see, it's not a difficult situation. Every one of the slides should take about maybe 5 minutes to prepare, 10 at the most if you're creative with pictures and wonderful things like that, which we like. But it's more the discussion and the thinking and the group cohesion that I'm looking for in this project. Now let me step back a second and describe what we're trying to get at when we get into the issue of an ethical moment, because I think this is key to the entire week's project. when we're talking about ethical moment, we're talking about, as I said earlier in the video, the emotions you experience when you're confronted with something that strikes you hard. Now, the definition of ethics should be understood at this point. Ethics is not necessarily a code of action, right or wrong. It's a system of beliefs, sometimes called a moral philosophy. And that moral philosophy is very personal, but it is your code of conduct given your belief sets. Certain religions have codes of conduct. Societies have codes of conduct. That's where laws come from. Criminals have codes of conduct. Gangs have codes of conduct in which a member of the gang violates that code. It's been an ethical violation. I'm not making a moral equivalence here, but there are things that you believe in that allow the organization to suffer. Certainly the mafia had codes of conduct that people knew when their values were transgressed, and boom, heads rolled. Those are not equal moral equivalents, but they point to the fact that there are certain ways of looking at problems that professions, societies, students, academia listen to, and putting them together, religions, putting them together, they become a moral philosophy, which is a system of beliefs about how to behave, and implicitly, if you are part of that culture, religion, tradition, you adhere to those set of beliefs. And the ethical standards that we're talking about here, that we're asking you to look at, is to whether or not your action is consistent with your beliefs. If your action is consistent with your beliefs, it's considered to be ethical behavior. If your action is not, you're considered to be a hypocrite, someone who says something and does the other. And Lord knows, I can give you many examples of that. But we're trying to grasp, to narrowly focus on the notion of the distinction between ethical values and the morality, in which we have usually three options to take for every time we confront a situation that violates or challenges our ethical standards. There's really only three choices. One, when you see something or are experiencing something that violates your notion of what is considered an ethical standard, an activity or a standard or a belief that you adhere to, that you believe in, and you see something happening that violates that, you can either vigorously respond to it and act in support of it, and that's typically considered a moral action. That's typically considered an action that is very consistent with your ethical standards. It quite often requires you to do something that's quite difficult, to take an ethical action to, for example, identify a classmate that you see as cheating, or to confront an individual who's being abused, or to confront a clear situation of bias or bigotry or prejudice in a way that you're opposing a group. If it's consistent with your ethical standards, those are tough choices because they require you to put yourself on the line, to be consistent with your ethical beliefs because you feel you don't have any other choice. You could not rest comfortably if you did not. And yet in doing so, you're risking yourself. You're perhaps doing physical harm. If you're in a corporation and you become a whistleblower, you're risking your job, you're risking your foundation, you're risking your family. But you're doing it because you believe that ethically to do the opposite would be unacceptable. In doing so, the person taking the moral position typically does not have any material benefit, only consequences. If it doesn't go right, it all may turn out okay, but quite often the person taking the ethical standard is the one that suffers pain, but he or she does it because it's more important to believe in their standards, to adhere to their standards, than it is to do something else. Now that is a position that pure ethics suggests is appropriate, but we are human, and my guess is that probably 90% of us pass on those situations when they're confronted. Now, the other opposite end of that is the immoral situation. Moral is first, immoral is the other end. Immoral is when you have a set of beliefs, but you have no problem violating them. You have no problem espousing religious beliefs, but participating in heinous crimes for personal gain. You have no problem betraying a friend if it's in your personal interest. You have no problem cheating in school. You have no problem cheating on your income tax. And again, whether they're legal or illegal, I'm not getting into, but if those things conflict with your stated view of ethics, you're considered immoral. Immorality is defined here as ignoring your stated view of ethics and acting in your total self-interest, regardless of the impact on your ethical values. There's probably 5 or 10% of us in that category too, and you know who you are. But the biggest category, and the one that concerns me the most, and the whole purpose for this class, is the middle category, in which you're confronted with a situation you find difficult, and you know is wrong, and it pains you to watch it continue. but for a variety of reasons, many of them legitimate, there's no second guessing here, you decide to look the other way, to take no action, to allow the bad thing to happen, to allow the consequences. You can watch the success of cheating. You can watch the impact of a student being abused, a colleague being abused. You can watch a crime being committed. You can watch somebody being tortured, as we just had with the situation of our detainees in Afghanistan, and look the other way, as many people in the federal government did. And most of us find very good reasons for doing that. They're financial, they're job security, our family needs us, I'm not going to stop it, it can only hurt. There's tons of reasons that justify and rationalize that decision. But I would like you to understand that when you make that decision, you are making a decision that we call amoral. You're intentionally saying that in this particular case, my personal needs trump my ethical values to do the right thing. Don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that you must sacrifice your personal needs. I'm saying that you must recognize that you're making a choice, and don't blow it away, walk away, pretend the choice wasn't there. We all have choices, because we have found that individuals who are able to jump that line and go from their comfort level to taking an ethical standard are the ones that have typically made society's value system as strong as it is. And so those are the three choices that we have: moral, amoral, or immoral. And I'm going to be asking you to have that in mind when you review the video tape. And again, there's no clear line of action here. You know, just consider the same kinds of actions can be ethical in one environment and non-ethical in another. Think of the difference of a judge who is in any kind of legal proceeding is morally required to get the truth out for the decision, the testimony, the court proceedings, the oaths of office, and the judge's rules to ensure the integrity of the judicial process and the integrity of the dialogue, the exchanges, and the information that's put forth. But consider the situation of a CIA agent whose entire job is deceit, whose entire job is to make people think something other than the truth, whose entire job is to manipulate and cause individuals to take actions they wouldn't otherwise take. Two individuals, one whose value system is one that focuses on deceit, one whose value system focuses on honesty. There are two different ethical standards there. And so evaluating the rightness or wrongness of their actions must be within the ethical standards of that whole community. Now, it might be that as society, we wind up saying that a profession like an intelligence analyst that is bound, especially at the operational level, that's bound on deceit is not something we want. And we as a society can adjust that. But as long as we have those professions, highly respected, in place, we tend to adhere to rules of conduct that allow a CIA officer or any intelligence officer to lie, to deceive in order to conduct his job. And yet we would never allow lying and deceit in a court of law. Similar example is soldiers versus nurses. Soldiers are trained and paid to kill. Nurses are trained and paid to save lives and ease suffering. It's not the action, it's the value system within which the action takes place. Let's take a look for a second before I close up with on a couple of other things. Perhaps now is a good time to flick this off and watch that. It's posted online because in that video you're going to see a situation in which at the end of a long and horrific war, World War II, a group of people who banded together for the beginning of the invasion of Normandy, hit the beaches together and spent a year and a half through some of the more difficult battles, found themselves at the end of the war in a situation where they knew the war was going to end, or their role in the war was going to end in a few days, and they were working for a general, who became a general, a colonel, who wound up deciding that at the end of the war, it was in his interest to begin building up as many statistics as he could so as to position himself for a good position in the Pentagon or in the European field after the war. In those days, many people were looking for their post-war assignments. The danger was done, and they're trying to position themselves, and he found that, this guy's name is Colonel Sink, you'll see it in the movie, he found that he was best suited to use the time available to gather as many statistics as he could on prisoners of war that he had captured. And this is a true story. And so he began sending his men out on needless missions with the whole purpose of getting more prisoners of war so that he could build up his stats and compete for significant post-war jobs. Now, these missions were not insignificant. They were at night, they were raids, they were in enemy-held territory, and they were dangerous. And the staff and his subordinate, Captain Winters, who wound up becoming world famous not because of this book, but because of his overall leadership style. He was a member of this band of brothers. He was promoted through the death of a colleague during the war, and he became the leader. He was the captain in the film. He became a major later on of the people that he grew up with, and he had an ethical bond with his brothers to do the right thing, keep them alive, fight the war, but their joint survival was the strongest ethical standard among them. And so Captain Winters is confronted with a situation in which his boss is giving orders that were putting his men at risk for purposes that he could not understand or discern or agree with. And the video will elaborate on this, and I'd like you to watch it, but in reality, Captain Winters is soon confronted with a situation in which to follow through with the colonel's orders is going to unnecessarily put his men at risk. A needless mission, a needless proposition, a needless casualty, and he took action that was based on his understanding of the right thing and which required a lot of moral courage. So in doing that, take a look at how I have framed the assignment, the template for your PowerPoints. I think it will help you. First of all, I'd like you to put this project into a title page that I have listed there for you, in which pretty clear what you're doing, why you're doing it, who the group leader is, who the team members are, and the date that's submitted. I'd like you to also have a table of contents that shows exactly each of the sections, which student is doing what. I can look at that when I review the participation logs that I keep and in looking at the final grade for the group. I like the first one to deal with the issue of a situation, stakeholders, and in doing so, I prefer that it's a PowerPoint slide, but I'd like you to have complete thoughts. I said complete sentences in the instructions. If you want to write this as a narrative, it's fine, but I'd like a series of complete thoughts so that I can get a clear understanding that you understand the situation, not one-word bullets in your PowerPoint. So I described the situation in my slide 1. This is an HBO documentary. It was about Charlie Company. You'll see all that in the write-up that we're also passing out. There were difficult battles, many casualties. Captain Winters was one of the groups and had been promoted to a battlefield, etc. Describe the situation that sets the tone of the problem. I'd like the next slide then to deal with what we call the ethical moment. I'd like the name of each student to be on that slide right there. And the ethical moment should be a sentence that conveys to me and to your group your understanding of the situation and the moment that it conveyed, and what the individual, the key person you're focusing on, faced, the choices that he or she had, and to describe them. There may be more ethical moments. In this case, I think that Winters had many ethical moments, and we simply listed them there. So at least you're conveying the fact that you are aware that from each of these moments, the principal in the video had a choice to make. And that choice was going to define the rest of his actions. The next one is the perspective tape, in which I indicate that there are other alternatives. Winters, in effect, began a process that resulted in him violating the military code of conduct. He could have suffered significant consequences, but in fact, but he didn't because of his ethical values. But there is another perspective, and that the military code of conduct is in place for a reason, and that the ethics associated with following orders and the ethics associated with staff discipline is a pretty significant value in the American military. And there are many people, and I've shown this video to hundreds of people over the years who are in the military, who are in law enforcement, who have a tremendous problem with the notion that somehow sanctioning an insubordinate action is okay. But I'm not saying it's okay. I'm saying this is a choice that was made consistent with ethical values, and it was a proper choice. Now, whether it was a legal choice, whether society accepted the choice or not, but you'll see that Major Winters here made a choice that he believed was absolutely required for his ethical values. There are other perspectives, and I'd like this particular slide to address other perspectives that put the action, in this case Winters' action, in context. As I say in the slide, Winters didn't know for sure that it was a pointless mission. He couldn't have known. He did not know for sure if there was any intelligence that was being gained. He did not know for sure where it could have been differently if he had taken steps to prevent the order from being given before he took his action. Number 4 is how difficult is a situation on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 being the most difficult decision. I felt that it was a 5. I think he faced immediate consequences that would be horrific for he and his men if the decision went bad, and that he knowingly did it. He wrestled with the decision. You could see it in his face in the film. He felt he had no choice. Number 5 is the one I'd like from the institutional perspective. What choices could have been made that would have been different here? This is a huge one, because in weighing options, this is not an individual choice. This steps back. What are the kinds of things that the organization could have done? What could the military have done to perhaps make it less likely that Colonel Sink would be giving what most people consider to be a needless and pointless order for his own career? Are there things that we in the organizational end of things could say that the lack of attention to these kinds of motivations are creating ethical situations that are dysfunctional? This is an important one for the overall deliverable about how the organization that we're working in, from a business and government perspective, can minimize the extent to which individuals are faced with these dilemmas. And then finally, the group choice that you would make in the situation. And that's really all you have to do for the slide. And again, the face-to-face class will present it in a poster board situation. I detailed the instructions how I would like the online class to post these slides in the discussion blog, and I'm going to ask students to pick one of the presentations to make their specific comments on. We'll elaborate more on that in the end of next week after the presentations are made. But the face-to-face class will have the discussion through poster board, in-class situation. The online class will have the discussion will have their discussion and comments through the routine discussion board. Finally, the issue of corporate responsibility is covered very well in the text, and I don't want to take any more video time to elaborate on that. I just suggest that you look carefully at the chapter as to what we're talking about in terms of corporate social responsibility. Typically, we're looking at an evolving understanding, especially since Enron, that corporations now have a responsibility to society, part of their ethical responsibility, to do several things that that contribute to the betterment of society, especially if they're successful. As such, corporations are being asked to volunteer their time to meet the basic economic needs of their company through innovation, to exceed legal requirements in adhering to law and practice, to find ways to enhance community and contribute to mutually beneficial actions, and to provide acts of charity to society as a whole that's separate from just maximizing their profits. Again, the text does a pretty good job of describing that. I would commend you to reading that, because it will have some questions on the exam about that. But I want to just make the distinction here that that's the other part of the course that's equally important, and that is the notion of, from a business perspective, what is being expected from businesses as a whole in response to what has been ethical transgressions over time. I hope this video helps put things in perspective for the class. I'll be dealing with you through Ask the Professor for anything that's specific, and I can't wait to see your presentation. Thank you.